Thomas Carter had always thought of himself as an ordinary man leading a quiet, uneventful life. He worked at a local library in a small town surrounded by dense forests and misty hills. Life was predictable until the day he found the letter. It wasn't just any letter. It was written by his late grandfather, a man Thomas barely remembered, but whose presence loomed large in family stories. His grandfather had been eccentric, often disappearing for days on end, muttering about secrets buried deeper than roots. No one ever understood what he meant, and over time, people stopped asking. The letter arrived unexpectedly. While sorting through some old boxes left behind after his parents passed away, Thomas stumbled upon a dusty envelope tucked inside a photo album. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably his grandfather's, shaky yet deliberate. Curious, Thomas opened it carefully, almost reverently. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age. As he unfolded it, his eyes scanned the words, feeling a strange mix of confusion and intrigue. "Dear Thomas," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone. And you've likely wondered why I spent so many nights staring at the stars or wandering the woods alone. There is something I must tell you, though not everything can be said here. What I leave behind is more than memories. It is a responsibility. Vain everything else, beneath the soil near my final resting place, lies something that must not remain hidden forever." Thomas read the sentence over and over again, trying to make sense of it. Responsibility, hidden, resting place. The cryptic message gnawed at him, planting seeds of doubt and curiosity. Was this some kind of prank? Or was there really something buried near his grandfather's grave? The idea seemed absurd, yet the tone of the letter felt urgent, almost desperate. His mind drifted back to childhood stories about his grandfather. People used to whisper that he dabbled in things best left untouched. Strange books, odd symbols carved into trees, and late-night meetings with strangers who vanished like ghosts. At the time, Thomas dismissed these tales as exaggerations, but now they resurfaced with renewed intensity. Could there be truth to them? And if so, what exactly had his grandfather been involved in? As days turned into weeks, Thomas couldn't shake off the feeling that the letter was calling out to him, urging him to act. He tried ignoring it, burying the envelope under piles of other papers, but sleep became restless. Dreams of shadowy figures and echoing whispers haunted him. Finally, one evening, unable to resist any longer, he decided to visit the cemetery where his grandfather was buried. Maybe seeing the grave would bring clarity, or maybe it would put his doubts to rest once and for all. With the letter tucked safely in his pocket, Thomas drove to the cemetery late at night. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. Shadows stretched long under the pale glow of the moonlight, giving the place an eerie charm. Standing before the weathered headstone, Thomas hesitated. Digging up a grave felt wrong, disrespectful even. But the pull was irresistible, like an invisible thread tugging him forward. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed a shovel from his car and began digging, determined to uncover whatever secrets lay beneath. Little did he know, this decision would change his life forever. The cemetery was eerily silent as Thomas stood in front of his grandfather's grave, the cold metal of the shovel heavy in his hands. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. Each movement he made felt exaggerated, the scrape of the shovel against the earth unnaturally loud in the stillness. He glanced around nervously, half expecting someone to appear and scold him for disturbing the dead. But no one came. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of dirt hitting the growing pile beside him. As he dug deeper, sweat trickled down his forehead despite the chilly night air. His muscles ached with each thrust of the shovel, but curiosity drove him onward. The letter's cryptic words echoed in his mind. Asterisk beneath the soil near my final resting place. Asterisk, what could possibly be buried here? A treasure? A confession? Or something far stranger? The thought sent shivers down his spine, though he couldn't tell if it was excitement or dread that chilled him. After what felt like hours, The shovel struck something solid. The metallic clang reverberated through the quiet cemetery, startling a flock of crows perched on a nearby tree. Their wings flapped noisily as they took flight, their cries piercing the silence. Thomas froze, his heart pounding. For a moment, he wondered if he should stop. What if this was all some elaborate hoax? But then again, what if it wasn't? Kneeling down, he brushed away the loose dirt with trembling hands. To his astonishment, he uncovered a rusted metal surface, a trapdoor embedded into the ground. It was rectangular, about the size of a large chest, with strange symbols etched into its surface. The designs were intricate, almost hypnotic, resembling patterns Thomas had seen in old books about ancient civilizations. They looked weathered, as though they'd been there for decades, untouched by time or human hands. Thomas stared at the door, his mind racing. Who could have put this here? And why? Had his grandfather known about it? More importantly, what lay beyond it? The questions swirled in his head, pulling him deeper into a web of mystery. He hesitated, gripping the edge of the trapdoor with both hands. Opening it felt like crossing a line, stepping into the unknown. But he had come too far to turn back now. Summoning his courage, Thomas pulled upward. The hinges groaned in protest, releasing a puff of stale air that smelled faintly of damp earth and something else. Something metallic, sharp, and unsettling. As the door creaked open, a dark void yawned before him, revealing nothing but impenetrable blackness. He fumbled for his flashlight, clicking it on, and shining the beam into the opening. The light revealed a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the depths below. A wave of unease washed over him as he peered inside. The air felt different here, heavier, colder, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. It was as though the very atmosphere was alive, watching, waiting. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to close the door and walk away. Yet, something stronger compelled him to stay. Maybe it was the promise of answers, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that whatever lay below was tied to him in ways he didn't yet understand. Taking a deep breath, Thomas steadied himself. He knew he was about to step into the unknown, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery would change everything. With one last glance over his shoulder to ensure he was still alone, he tightened his grip on the flashlight and began descending the stairs, each step creaking ominously beneath his weight. Whatever awaited him below, he was determined to find out, even if it meant confronting secrets better left buried. The staircase beneath the trapdoor was narrow and steep, its wooden steps groaning under Thomas's weight with every cautious step he took. The beam of his flashlight cut through the thick darkness, revealing walls made of rough, uneven stones that seemed ancient and damp. The air grew colder the deeper he went, carrying with it a musty smell that clung to his throat. Each breath felt heavier than the last, as though the atmosphere itself resisted his presence. His heart thudded in his chest, not just from exertion, but from the mounting tension of what he might find at the bottom. As he descended, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Every creak of the stairs echoed unnaturally loudly, blending with faint sounds that didn't belong. The soft rustle of fabric, the distant drip of water, and something else he couldn't quite place. It was almost like whispers, too low to make out clearly, yet persistent enough to send shivers crawling up his spine. He paused for a moment, straining his ears, but when he turned off the flashlight to listen more closely, the darkness pressed in on him so intensely that he quickly switched it back on. The staircase finally ended, opening into a small chamber that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades or centuries. The light from his flashlight revealed crumbling brick walls covered in faded murals. At first glance, they appeared to depict ordinary scenes. People gathered around fires, animals grazing in fields, and stars twinkling above mountains. But as Thomas moved closer, the images shifted into something darker. Shadowy figures wearing hooded robes performing rituals around an altar. Their faces were obscured, but their postures suggested reverence, fear, or perhaps both. In the center of one mural, There was a swirling void surrounded by claw-like shapes reaching outward, as if trying to escape. In the middle of the room stood a pedestal carved from black stone, its surface polished smooth despite the decay surrounding it. On top lay an ornate wooden box, intricately decorated with carvings of twisting vines and strange symbols that matched those on the trapdoor. Thomas approached it slowly, his footsteps hesitant. The closer he got, the stronger the unease became, as though the box itself radiated a malevolent energy. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly, and brushed away a thin layer of dust. The wood felt cold to the touch, unnatural, as if it had absorbed the chill of the underground chamber over countless years. But before he could open the box, a sound stopped him dead in his tracks, a faint, rhythmic noise that sent a jolt of terror through his body. It was breathing. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakably close. Thomas froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. He swung the flashlight around, searching for the source, but the beam only illuminated empty corners and shadowy alcoves. Still, the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. It wasn't coming from behind him. It was somewhere in the room, moving toward him. Panic began to creep into Thomas's thoughts. Was someone else down here, or was it something else entirely? He glanced back at the box, torn between curiosity and self-preservation. Whatever this place was, it wasn't meant to be discovered. Yet now that he'd found it, leaving without answers felt impossible. Summoning what little courage he had left, Thomas decided to open the box, hoping it would provide some clue about why his grandfather had led him here, and what the breathing belonged to. As he lifted the lid, his hands shook violently, unsure whether he was unlocking salvation or doom. The moment Thomas opened the box, a wave of cold air rushed out, making him stagger back a step. It wasn't just the temperature that unsettled him. It was the feeling that came with it, as though something ancient and restless had been waiting inside. The box contained a collection of objects that seemed both ordinary and profoundly strange. Brittle pages filled with cramped handwriting, small glass vials holding liquids of varying colors, and a tarnished locket resting atop everything else. But it was the journal that caught his attention first. Thomas carefully picked up the journal, its leather cover cracked and peeling. Flipping through the pages, he saw sketches of symbols similar to those on the walls, along with frantic scribbles detailing experiments and rituals. Some entries were barely legible, written in haste, while others were crossed out violently, as if their author regretted them the moment they were penned. One phrase appeared repeatedly. Asterisk, it watches, it waits. Asterisk. The word sent a chill down his spine. Who, or what, was watching? And why did it feel like those eyes were now fixed on him? As he examined the artifacts, the breathing grew louder, more deliberate. Each inhale and exhale echoed unnaturally in the confined space, reverberating off the stone walls. Thomas's flashlight flickered briefly, causing his heart to leap into his throat. He slapped the side of it instinctively, and the beam steadied, but the interruption was enough to heighten his sense of dread. Shadows danced erratically across the murals, distorting the figures into grotesque shapes that seemed alive for a fleeting second. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled from somewhere within the chamber. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The sound was guttural, primal, and filled with an intelligence that made Thomas's blood run cold. His hands trembled as he clutched the journal tighter, his mind racing. Was this what his grandfather had warned him about? Had he unwittingly awakened something buried not just beneath the earth, but beyond comprehension? Turning slowly, Thomas scanned the room with his flashlight. The beam illuminated nothing but the same crumbling walls and shadowy alcoves he'd seen before, yet the presence was undeniable. He could feel it now, pressing against him like a physical force, watching his every move. Then, without warning, the light caught something. A pair of glowing red eyes, hovering just above the ground in one of the darker corners of the chamber. Thomas froze, his breath hitching in his throat. The eyes didn't blink. They simply stared, unblinking and malevolent. They belonged to a figure that began to emerge from the shadows, slowly, deliberately. Its form was humanoid but wrong, stretched too thin, with elongated limbs that moved with unnatural fluidity. The creature's skin, if it could even be called that, was pale and translucent, revealing faint outlines of bones beneath. Its mouth hung open slightly, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and its claw-like hands twitched as though eager to grasp something. Paralyzed by fear, Thomas dropped the journal, the pages scattering across the floor. The creature tilted its head, studying him with an intensity that felt almost predatory. For a moment, neither moved. Then, with a sudden lurch, the entity stepped forward, its movements jerky yet impossibly fast. Thomas stumbled backward, his foot catching on the edge of the pedestal. Pain shot through his ankle, but adrenaline kept him moving. Grabbing his flashlight, he swung it toward the creature, hoping the light might drive it away. Instead, the thing let out a deafening screech, its voice piercing the silence like shattered glass. Desperation took over. Thomas scrambled to his feet, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. He knew he couldn't stay here, not with that thing closing in. Fumbling in his panic, he turned and bolted for the staircase, each step creaking under his weight. Behind him, the creature followed, its breathing growing louder and more labored, as if it were savoring the chase. Reaching the top, Thomas slammed the trapdoor shut with all his strength, praying it would hold. As he collapsed onto the damp grass outside, gasping for air, he realized two things. Whatever was down there wasn't done with him, and he may have just unleashed it upon the world. Thomas lay on the damp grass, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The cool night air felt like a balm against his sweat-soaked skin, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside him. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, replaying every terrifying moment from the chamber below. The creature's glowing red eyes, its unnatural movements, the guttural growl, it all felt too real to dismiss as some trick of the mind. Yet even as he stared up at the starless sky, part of him clung to the hope that it had been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But deep down, he knew better. The trapdoor was still there beneath him, sealed shut once more, though he could swear he heard faint scraping sounds coming from below, as if something were testing the barrier between them. Shaking off his paralysis, Thomas scrambled to his feet and stumbled toward his car, desperate to put distance between himself and the cemetery. He didn't dare look back. Once home, Thomas locked every door and window, though he knew no lock could keep out whatever had been in that chamber. Sitting at his kitchen table, he spread out the scattered pages of the journal he'd salvaged from the box, determined to make sense of what he'd uncovered. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. It belonged to his grandfather. As he read through the entries, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The journal detailed years of obsession with the other side, a realm beyond human understanding. His grandfather had been part of a group, perhaps the same robed figures depicted in the murals, that sought to communicate with entities they believed held unimaginable power. At first, their experiments seemed harmless, chanting rituals, drawing symbols, burning herbs. But over time, the tone of the entries grew darker, more frantic. They had succeeded in opening a doorway, but instead of gaining enlightenment, they unleashed something far worse, a being that demanded sacrifices and grew stronger with each offering. One entry stood out among the rest. Written in bold, jagged letters, it read, "Asterisk, it is not bound by flesh or form. It feeds on fear and despair. Once awakened, it cannot be contained." Asterisk, beneath this warning was a crude sketch of the very creature Thomas had encountered. The elongated limbs, the hollow eyes, the jagged teeth. His grandfather had seen it too. And judging by the final pages of the journal, which were smeared with ink and torn at the edges, he had spent his last days trying, and failing, to undo what they had done. Among the artifacts Thomas had brought with him was the tarnished locket. Opening it revealed a faded photograph of his grandfather standing alongside several others dressed in hooded robes. Their faces were solemn, almost fearful, and behind them loomed the same swirling void depicted in the mural. Thomas realized with growing horror that these people weren't just dabblers in the occult. They were pawns in a much larger game, one they barely understood. As dawn broke, Thomas sat back, exhausted but unable to sleep. The vials from the box sat untouched on the table, their contents shimmering faintly in the morning light. He wondered if they were part of the ritual that had summoned the creature, or perhaps tools to banish it. Either way, using them felt like playing with fire. Still, one thing was clear. His grandfather hadn't led him to the trapdoor simply to scare him. There was purpose behind it, a plea for help buried within the cryptic words of the letter. But help for whom? For the living, or for the thing now stirring in the depths below? As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Thomas sat hunched over the kitchen table, his mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. The journal entries painted a grim picture. His grandfather and his companions had opened a door they couldn't close, unleashing something ancient and malevolent. But why hadn't they destroyed the artifacts? Why leave behind vials, symbols, and instructions that could potentially reawaken the entity? It didn't make sense, unless they believed it was already too late to stop it. Thomas stared at the vials, their contents glowing faintly as if alive. One of them caught his attention, a deep crimson liquid that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He reached for it hesitantly, half expecting it to burn his skin or emit some kind of unnatural energy. But when his fingers brushed against the glass, it felt cold and ordinary. Still, he recoiled, unsure whether handling these objects was safe or wise. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise from outside, a low guttural growl that sent chills down his spine. It wasn't coming from within the house, but from somewhere nearby. Slowly, he rose from his chair and peeked through the window, scanning the yard. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar sight of trees swaying gently in the breeze. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted movement near the edge of the woods. A shadow darted between the trees, too fast to be an animal yet too large to be human. Whatever it was watching him. Panic surged through Thomas's veins. He quickly pulled the curtains shut and backed away from the window, clutching the locket tightly in one hand. His breathing quickened as he realized the creature wasn't confined to the underground chamber. It had followed him. Or worse, it had always been free, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Desperate for answers, Thomas returned to the journal. Flipping through the pages, he found a section detailing how the group had attempted to contain the entity using a combination of symbols and concoctions made from the liquids in the vials. According to the notes, the crimson liquid acted as a binding agent, capable of weakening the creature temporarily. But there was a warning scrawled in bold letters beneath the recipe. Asterisk use sparingly. Its hunger grows stronger with each use. Asterisk. Thomas hesitated, weighing his options. Using the vial might buy him time, but what if it drew the creature closer instead of repelling it? What if it only delayed the inevitable? His hands trembled as he held the small glass container, torn between fear and determination. Finally, steeling himself, he decided to test it, but cautiously. If the creature was indeed lurking outside, he needed to know whether the liquid worked before he became its next victim. Carrying the vial and a flashlight, Thomas crept toward the front door. Every creak of the floorboard sounded deafening in the silence, and his heart pounded so loudly he feared it would give him away. Opening the door just wide enough to slip through, he stepped onto the porch and shone the flashlight into the yard. The beam swept across the grass, revealing nothing but shadows. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd imagined the noise earlier. Then, without warning, the creature emerged from the darkness. It moved faster than before, its elongated limbs twisting unnaturally as it closed the distance between them. Thomas fumbled with the vial, unscrewing the cap with trembling hands. As the creature lunged, he hurled the crimson liquid at it, shouting instinctively. The substance splashed against its translucent skin, sizzling like acid. The creature let out an ear-piercing shriek, recoiling as smoke rose from where the liquid touched it. For a few precious seconds, it retreated, retreating back into the shadows. Thomas watched, breathless, as the figure disappeared into the woods. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. He knew this victory was temporary. The journal's warnings echoed in his mind. The creature's hunger grew stronger with each encounter. And now, thanks to him, it had tasted freedom once again. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights for Thomas. He tried to convince himself that the creature was gone, driven back into the shadows by the crimson liquid. But deep down, he knew better. The silence in his house felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Every creak of the floorboards made him jump. Every shadow seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. And then there were the dreams, vivid, haunting visions of glowing red eyes and twisted figures reaching out to him from the darkness. Desperate to rid himself of the artifacts, Thomas decided to destroy them. One evening, under the cover of night, he gathered the journal, the vials, and the locket, wrapping them tightly in an old cloth. Driving far away from town, he found a secluded clearing surrounded by dense trees. There he built a small fire, feeding it dry branches until the flames roared hungrily. As he tossed the items into the blaze, the fire crackled unnaturally, sending sparks spiraling into the air. For a moment, the flames turned an eerie shade of green, casting strange shadows on the ground. Then, just as suddenly, they returned to normal. Thomas stood there, watching the fire consume the objects, hoping this act would sever whatever connection he had with the entity. But even as the last remnants of the journal crumbled to ash, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't truly escaped. The problem wasn't just the artifacts. It was the knowledge they contained. Once unleashed, secrets like these couldn't be buried again. Back home, life became a series of restless routines. Thomas avoided the cemetery at all costs and rarely ventured outside after sunset. Yet no matter how hard he tried to move on, the past refused to let him go. Strange occurrences began happening around him. Objects moving on their own, whispers echoing in empty rooms, and faint footprints appearing on freshly cleaned floors. Each incident left him more shaken than the last, convincing him that the creature was still nearby, biding its time. One night, unable to bear the mounting tension any longer, Thomas confided in Sarah, an old friend who had always been skeptical of his family's eccentric reputation. Over coffee, he recounted everything: the letter, the trapdoor, the underground chamber, and the terrifying encounter with the creature. To his surprise, Sarah didn't dismiss him outright. Instead, she listened intently, her expression growing increasingly troubled. When he finished speaking, she leaned forward and said softly, "Thomas, you need to leave this place. Whatever your grandfather got mixed up in, it's bigger than you." Her words rattled him, not because they were unexpected, but because they mirrored his own fears. Leaving meant abandoning everything familiar: his home, his job, the only life he'd ever known. But staying felt equally impossible. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he resolved to pack his belongings and start anew somewhere far away. Maybe distance would give him a fighting chance. The next morning, however, reality struck harder than ever. As Thomas prepared to leave, he heard the sound that haunted his nightmares: the unmistakable breathing. It was close this time, too close. Freezing in place, he turned slowly toward the mirror hanging on the wall. At first, nothing seemed amiss. Then, reflected behind him, two glowing red eyes appeared, hovering just over his shoulder. His scream caught in his throat as the creature stepped fully into view, its jagged teeth gleaming in a twisted grin. Thomas stumbled backward, tripping over a suitcase and falling to the floor. The creature didn't attack immediately. Instead, it loomed over him, savoring his terror. Its presence filled the room, suffocating and overwhelming. In that moment, Thomas understood the truth. The entity hadn't been following him. It had been inside him all along, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to take control. As darkness closed in around him, his final thought was one of regret. He should have burned the letter the day he found it. Now, it was too late. The days that followed Thomas's encounter with the creature blurred into a living nightmare. Though he tried to fight it, the entity's presence grew stronger with each passing moment. It wasn't just haunting him anymore. It was inside his mind, whispering thoughts that weren't his own. At first, they were subtle suggestions. Leave the town. Burn everything. Forget what you saw. But soon, the whispers turned into commands, drowning out his own voice until he could no longer tell where he ended and the creature began. Thomas locked himself in his house, drawing all the curtains and refusing to answer the door or phone. He sat in the dim light of a single lamp, clutching the kitchen knife as though it could protect him from something far beyond human comprehension. Sleep became impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those glowing red eyes staring back at him. The breathing, the constant, suffocating sound of breathing, followed him everywhere, even when he pressed his hands over his ears. One night, unable to endure the torment any longer, Thomas stood before the mirror again. His reflection looked gaunt, hollow-eyed, like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. But then, slowly, the face in the mirror changed. Its features twisted into something grotesque, elongated, pale, with jagged teeth forming a cruel grin. Thomas stumbled backward, dropping the knife as the realization hit him. The creature wasn't just watching anymore. It was taking over. He screamed for help, but no one came. The house was silent except for the sound of his ragged breathing and the faint echo of laughter coming from somewhere deep within his own head. Desperation drove him to try anything: prayers, rituals, even smashing the mirror in hopes of breaking the connection. But nothing worked. The pieces of glass scattered across the floor reflected the same horrifying image: the creature wearing his face. By the end of the week, Thomas barely resembled the man he once was. His movements were jerky and unnatural, mimicking the way the creature had moved in the underground chamber. His speech slurred, words spilling out in fragments that made no sense. Neighbors noticed strange noises coming from his house: scratching, thudding, and low growls. But none dared approach. When Sarah finally mustered the courage to knock on his door, she found it unlocked, creaking open to reveal an empty hallway. Inside, the air felt wrong, heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. She called out his name, but there was no response. As she ventured further into the house, she saw signs of chaos: a shattered mirror, overturned furniture, and strange symbols scrawled on the walls in what looked like dirt or ash. In the center of the living room lay the locket, its tarnished surface gleaming faintly. Against her better judgment, she picked it up and opened it, revealing the faded photograph of Thomas's grandfather and the robed figures. For a split second, she thought she saw movement in the picture, one of the figures turning its head to look directly at her. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the breathing began. Slow and deliberate, it filled the room, growing louder with each passing second. Sarah dropped the locket and ran, slamming the door behind her as fast as she could. She never returned to the house, nor did anyone else. Days later, the authorities conducted a search after reports of suspicious activity, but Thomas was nowhere to be found. The house was sealed off, deemed unsafe due to structural instability, though rumors spread among townsfolk that something unnatural lingered there. Weeks passed, and life in the small town went on. But late at night, when the streets were empty and the wind carried the scent of damp earth, some claimed to see a figure wandering near the cemetery. Thin, pale, with glowing red eyes, it moved silently between the graves, searching for something or someone. And if you listened closely enough, you might hear the faint sound of breathing, echoing through the trees like a warning. Thomas Carter was gone, consumed by the very secrets he had sought to uncover. What remained was no longer human, a vessel for something ancient and hungry. Somewhere, buried beneath the soil, the trapdoor waited patiently, ready to claim its next victim.